Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sustainable and Smart Building webinar series. I'm Ding Li, Partner Business Development Manager here at CLP Innovation Smart Energy Connect, your moderator today. So at CLP Innovation, I developed a group innovation business partner ecosystem and advice on market needs in terms of smart and sustainable solutions. Before joining CLP Innovation, I act as a sustainability strategy consultant with a primary focus of real estate sectors. Today's session is towards a net zero carbon future, reducing carbon footprint. I want to introduce you the presenter, Liam Salter, the CEO of Reset Carbon. Reset work focused on developing and implementing commercially driven low carbon and other environmental management programs for Asian and international corporate clients. Previously, Liam was the director of WWF International Asia Pacific Climate Program, where he also co-led the design and set up the gold standard, which is now a leading certification system for project level carbon offset and other environmental and social attributes. Today, we'll cover why net zero carbon is becoming increasingly important, the challenge faced by the real estate sectors, as well as the trends and some best practices. Just a little housekeeping before we start. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of this webinar, so we have enabled a feature which is on the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions, just pop them in there. I'll bring them up during the presentation, and we'll have time for questions at the end of this webinar. And if you missed anything, don't worry, we'll send around the on-demand material after today's session. So before we start, let's have a quick poll to warm everyone up and understand more about you all. You can participate through this Zoom poll, and which I will share with you right now. So you will have around 10 seconds to vote for what you think is the best answer for yourself. So have you set a carbon reduction target? Right. So seems like most of you, if not that you have already set a target, you are going to set a target in the future. So that the second question is, have you ever considered a net zero carbon commitment? So there are three options. Yes, it's an ongoing commitment. Second, we'll consider it after today's webinar, or no such plan at this moment. You have 10 more seconds to vote. All right, I'm gonna close this poll. So it seems like a lot of you have ongoing commitment for net zero carbon. And if not, you consider to set a commitment after today's webinar, which is good news for us. Thank you for joining. Thank you for participating in this poll. Without further ado, I would like to give the time to Liam Salter for the upcoming presentation.
Thank you, Ding. So as Ding said, I'm CEO at Reset. Our business is very much focused on working with corporate customers to reduce environmental footprint. That's our mission statement. And so as a business, we differentiate ourselves by linking strategy, the kind of the data piece, the technical environmental consulting around footprinting, and the engineering solutions into a sort of a vertical service to help businesses achieve that. And we work across quite a lot of sectors, as you can see from some of our customers. And that's very much the lens that we'll be bringing to the sort of the building sector conversation this morning. Key messages from the presentation. What we see is that carbon historically in real estate has been more of an aspirational issue for leaders to use to reinforce their reputation, which delivers commercial benefits. We think that's changing. We think it's turning into a risk issue, which means it's going to become material for much more mainstream companies, a much larger number of companies than what we've seen so far. So less about aspiration, more about risk, less about leaders, more about mainstream businesses. A much larger share of the real estate market, we believe, is going to be interested or perhaps pushed pretty hard in some cases to act on carbon. This is going to be driven by an increased understanding of risks and visibility of risks in real estate. And we're going to talk about World Business Council Net Zero program as a framework for managing that risk and some of the challenges and opportunities that this provides to real estate companies. So first of all, I think, you know, risks are becoming more material from carbon. We can see it. 2019, I think, was a pretty big year. Lots of very visible impacts, clear attribution to climate change, and a recognition from all kinds of parts of society that climate impact means cost. And so, you know, from real estate to utilities to insurance and so on, an increasing concern about what this is going to look like in the future, right? So we for sure are exposing ourselves to more and more of these impacts. How do we know that businesses we're working for, investing in, managing, are going to be managing not just the risks of the impacts themselves, but the transition risks of governments and policymakers as they regulate to reduce emissions? One important thing to bear in mind is that many climate impacts in the future will be preventable. So, you know, basically the hotter it gets, the worse it gets. We're somewhere close to a 1 degree increase already. If we go above 2 degrees, it gets pretty horrible. And many governments, cities, companies are aligning themselves around a 1.5 or a 2 degree target as a way of giving themselves a frame of reference for how to manage their emissions. So the more we reduce, the more costs we avoid. We can see very clearly, we've got a lot of good modeling now that shows pretty much what our emissions need to look like in order to avoid certain levels of impact, temperature change and cost. So this is an International Energy Agency 2 degree scenario. It tells we have to get down to about 10 gigatons a year by 2060 if we want to prevent the temperature going above 2 degrees. And there are 1.5 degree scenarios and 3 degree scenarios and so on. Within that, what we're starting to see is buildings becoming a feature. So we can see in this chart here that buildings is this rather thin green line on the top, but actually buildings are also taking a lot of the power emissions as well. So they're a chunk of that purple line as well. Building emissions worldwide are around 40% of total CO2. About 28% of that is building operations, and the rest is kind of upstream. So again, what we're starting to be able to do is understand how my emissions performance influences my ability to manage risk. And, you know, the better my emissions performance, the more risk averse my business can be, particularly when it comes to managing the transition risks associated with government policy, which are going to be put in place to drive emissions down. So as I said, real estate is being pulled out and is, you know, clearly a priority. We need to drop global emissions from buildings by about 80% by 2050 for a 2 degree scenario and more for a 1.5 degree scenario. If you look at a good report from Pacific Exchange recently, the Hong Kong 2050 decarbonization scenario, you can see that building energy efficiency after the power sector has acted, building energy efficiency is the next most important thing for Hong Kong to act on in order to hit a 1.5 degrees target, which would be going net zero by 2050. So what's very, very clear is that buildings are getting prioritized, and the performance of buildings is coming under increasing scrutiny as a result of that. What we can see today from governments is absolutely just the beginning. If you look at the sort of Paris commitments, that's about 3.5 degrees of warming. So we're going to have to go much further than that. And I think we can already see some countries, some city governments moving way, way out ahead of what we see from Paris in terms of level of ambition. What's really important is that, real estate owners or investors are essentially exposing their assets to all of this, right? So if we're building a 40-year lifetime property today, it's going to be around to 2060. That building's going to be exposed to whatever the policy environment is all the way up to 2060. And by 2060, we should be carbon neutral, we should be net zero. So whatever happens today, these properties are going to be exposed to it. And for me, it's almost like this is almost the riskiest period for real estate, because the idea of carbon risk is so new. Where governments are going to go in terms of regulation is still quite uncertain. So a lot of people are ignoring it. And yet, for most of the lifetime of this property, it's going to be exposed to, let's say, a carbon constrained regulatory environment. So I think this is the beginning of, for many companies for this discussion, the riskiest time in terms of putting up assets that might get impaired later on in their life. Governments understand they've got to act on existing buildings. 2/3 of today's building stock today's building stock will be 2/3 of the 2050 building stock in many, many economies, right? So this isn't, yes, new build is important, but existing build is probably more important from an emissions reduction perspective. And as far as governments are concerned, they're going to have to regulate into existing building stock without question if they want to hit their targets. And they'll do that through carbon pricing, energy efficiency standards, these kinds of things, which are going to impose greater costs on carbon inefficient real estate, which is going to lead to asset impairment. What's also interesting is we see the world of the investor and the financier looking at this sector and saying, well, we don't have enough data to evaluate this risk. And so we've seen the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, as a methodology for providing a standardized approach to communicating this risk from this sector and other sectors to investors, banks, insurers, and so on, so that they can better understand how companies are managing this risk. So not only are the risks getting visibly more material, but the pressure to disclose and the ability of outside actors to look into a business and benchmark it against other potential investments is becoming much stronger. And finally, we do see also a push from commercial tenants who also have carbon targets and are looking to building owners and managers to help them with that. So we see quite a lot of business push on this that we perhaps didn't see 12 months ago, 24 months ago, and we believe this market's shifting pretty quickly. Just an example from New York. New York's got an ambitious carbon target. They have put in place the Climate Mobilization Act. It's designed for large buildings. There's several components to it, but I think the bit that interested me was essentially there is a carbon charge for buildings that do not perform to the carbon standard that the Act is laying out. So for different types of building space, they are putting out tons of CO2 per square foot standards. And basically, if you're above that, you get fined $268 a ton of carbon dioxide. That's about, that kind of level of charge would roughly double your utility bill in Hong Kong today. to give you a feel for how expensive it is. So it's roughly double your energy bill if you were getting charged on all of it. And obviously the charge may only come on part of it, but that's potentially a significant cost. So that's 2019 New York, and then you look on the right and you see a long list of cities who are bringing in similar levels of ambition of carbon target to New York, and it's actually much longer than that. This is just an example, but 80% plus reductions by 2050. So they're all going to have to do something like this if they want to hit these targets. There's, as you can see from the Hong Kong example, if you took building efficiency out of the equation, forget it. You know, these targets can't be achieved. So just talking a little bit about TCFD, as I said, it's pretty interesting because I think it's being taken very seriously by a lot of businesses because of kind of who you're reporting it to. So the fact that it's being baked into a lot of the financial and risk conversations with companies, it's less of a sustainability conversation in some ways. It's a whole new group of actors that are looking at this issue through a much different lens. And TCFD looks at physical risk, which is impacts on buildings, which I'm not really going to talk about today, and what they call transition risk for existing buildings, and obviously it's relevant for new buildings. BlackRock, largest asset investor globally, is pretty clear in terms of how companies it's investing into should be using TCFD guidelines. They want it. They want, one of the things that TCFD does is it says, we want you to show us through a scenarios analysis how your business is going to manage a world that regulates carbon. So they say you should go and regulate. You should model what would happen if the Paris commitments get implemented and we move to a 2 degrees or a 1.5 degrees future, and show us how your business is prepared for that or preparing for that. So it's very, very interesting. It's quite specific in terms of what it's asking for. It's the onus is really on the companies to show how they understand the risk and then what their strategies are for managing it. We have a couple of customers that are invested in by BlackRock, and really their attitude changed almost overnight once this letter came out last year to the companies that BlackRock is investing into. And so that's just one example. I think a lot of other asset managers, banks and investors are communicating TCFD in different ways, but it all looks pretty serious. So then the question becomes, okay, what are we going to do about that? Obviously, the World Green Building Council Net Zero program is an interesting one because it's very aligned with the concerns that people who look at risk have. You know, there's a commitment to operating existing assets at net zero carbon as soon as possible. If you sign up, there's a commitment to disclosure. If you sign up, there's a commitment to, from 2030, having your new build kicking in at net zero. And everything needs to be wrapped up by 2050. That's probably a bit long, to be honest. But the advantages of net zero are it's pointing us in the right direction. It's carbon only. So we don't, you know, it allows us to really focus on the issues that we need to focus on if we're to manage this risk, whereas a lot of the other standards are sort of multi-environmental. Prioritizes existing buildings. So a lot of people with net zero commitments, a lot of companies with net zero commitments are moving into their existing portfolios first. It's where we can make very, very quick progress. It's demanding portfolio-wide commitments, so less building by building and merely what are we going to do across the whole asset base. The only challenge I think with net zero is the timetable. It probably doesn't push us hard enough. I think we should be looking at net zero by 2030, 2035. You can go for a 2050 net zero existing buildings commitment if you want to. I suspect that's going to get tightened up. So it does leave a little bit of flexibility in there for people to decide how fast they want to act. And obviously speed of action is important. We want to move ahead of the regulatory curve. So that's one thing to bear in mind. But in general, it's a good program to follow. There's a lot of excellent case studies and participants are really developing this issue all the time. We just wanted to talk a bit from our side about some of the things that we've seen, excuse me, that come up when we start to consider these deep carbon reduction targets across a building's portfolio. Some of this work is based on experience we've got in retail, some hospitality, we've done a lot of manufacturing. We've got companies with mixed portfolios. We've we work a lot with Hong Kong Airport. Some of the universities also have a similar sort of approach. Many of these challenges are the same, irrespective of what your exact building portfolio looks like. I think first of all, how do you set a target? It's really, really important to get, if we're going to set something ambitious, we've got to get senior management involved. We see a really, really clear difference between businesses that have the CEO conscious and supportive versus a project that is struggling to engage C-suite. It's a completely different discussion. It's much harder to get decent targets. So that's really important to build in. It requires a bespoke portfolio strategy. Essentially, we've got this group of assets and we need a strategy for going in and getting the reductions out. And it looks very, very different from business to business. You might drive it by property size, property age. It might be driven by location in terms of where we think properties are exposed to risk. It might even be driven by where we think we can get started. You know, where's the best engineering team? Who's most willing to act quickly within the company and get the ball rolling and demonstrate the business model? So thinking very carefully about the portfolio, where the emissions come from, and building an approach that makes sense for the business in terms of transaction costs, cost savings, and other benefits is really, really important. That's definitely not a standardized thing. Scenario planning is also important. When you project a business out even to 2030, that's a much longer planning horizon than most businesses are used to. And so you get into a whole realm of uncertainty from, say, 2025 onwards, where you have to start having discussions within the business about strategic options without having all the data at your fingertips. And that's pretty tricky if you're talking to an engineering team or something like that. So who are used to making decisions with much, much more sort of granular data at their fingertips. We found that to be quite challenging. And certainly, you know, what it pushes us in the direction of is really bringing in the critical stakeholders very, very early in the process so they understand what they're getting into. And they don't think that they're required to sign off on some 10-year strategy that has to be executed no matter what. It's going to be much more nuanced than that. And we need to make sure that people understand this isn't like a super concrete action plan. It might be for the first 3 years, but then after that, we're going to have to give ourselves some flexibility because we don't fully understand which options are going to kick in and what they're going to cost and how they're going to pay back and so on. So realistic approach to scenario planning, I think, is really important. Getting the data right, we see a lot of our customers, once they get to a certain point, shifting to some kind of cloud-based software system. That probably is going to be essential, I think. If you've got a big portfolio, it's very hard to run it on spreadsheets. We've got to go whole building, which means we've got to get the tenants' data in as well. That can also be quite challenging. And we need to develop meaningful KPIs. One of the things we see is, you know, something like a carbon emissions per unit floor area is getting used a lot. And then depending upon your building type, that's getting benchmarked, and then maybe even benchmarked by location. So the great thing about commercial real estate in particular is how much data there is available to tell us how individual buildings perform against market averages. And so that we're going to have to definitely use all of that to help set meaningful KPIs for the engineering teams to then go implement. And then that translates into we've got to report across the whole portfolio, not just the good bits. So that holistic approach to data is definitely something that needs to be given careful attention. With energy efficiency, I think what we've, in commercial buildings, we can see fantastic case studies all over the place about major energy savings, superb use of technology, great ROI. What I think is important is that this now shifts to portfolio-wide conversation. So we should be talking about portfolio total energy spend, not individual buildings. To give an example, we had a hospitality customer, 80, 90 sites. And we were talking, you know, at individual property level about energy efficiency. When we switched the conversation to, okay, what's the spend portfolio wide? It was like, you know, 160, 170 million US a year. It's a totally different set of actors within the business that then start to look at that. We start to move from talking about individual discussions where we might save a few $100,000 per year to a program that could save 25 million a year. And so very few companies actually understand what they spend across their whole portfolio and manage energy costs at this level. But we certainly found that that's a very good lens to approach it through, which then ties really into this idea of managing carbon emissions across the whole of the asset base. Finally, renewables, it's new. We are seeing a whole range of different options coming to market. Obviously, in commercial buildings, a lot of the time, the on-site renewables potential is quite limited compared to the load inside the building. So we're particularly going to need to see more off-site solutions, a lot of demand in our customer base for being linked somehow to a new renewable energy project. So not so much over-the-counter renewable energy certificates, but maybe something like a PPA model that we see in the US. And this is one of the reasons why research at CLP, because they're experts in this area, and we need to see more choice and more options, certainly for our customer base in places like China and Southeast Asia from a renewables perspective. And we do see that coming. So we see quite a lot of innovation in a couple of Southeast Asian markets right now, for example. Finally, the sort of the other interesting piece from my perspective is if we have a plan that's going to drive a 10-year plan to drive significant carbon reductions and save a load of money with a strong ROI, that's very investable. And obviously we see a lot of real estate companies doing green bonds, sustainability-linked loans. These kinds of programs, I think, are perfect for financing externally if that's something that a business wants to do, because we can wrap everything up, its timetable, it's got a return on investment, and it can be moved and tracked as a kind of discrete sort of financial product. So definitely see the opportunity for external finance to drive this, even in companies that aren't used to issuing green bonds, because it becomes external finance for risk management in a way. Not something we see that much of yet, but we're expecting more of that as the market matures. So those are kind of some of the top line thoughts that we had as a business that is focused on reducing corporate-wide carbon footprints. A couple of case studies.
Sorry, no, sorry. Yeah. I just had a burning question, but I can ask later.
You can ask now, no problem.
Sure. Thanks for sharing with us this holistical journey about decarbonization and how to achieve net zero. I'm just curious, like, do you have any example that you can share with us? For example, say, because we have a lot of companies that we have get in touch to, they will say they already set like ambitious carbon reduction targets before, year on year, 5%, 7%, 10% reduction, and all the low-hanging fruits are gone right now. And then senior management wants them to set an even more ambitious carbon reduction target and even achieving net zero carbon. So how would you convince, the facility management team that this is doable? How do we make sure that we have the buy-in?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we see very few portfolios without investable opportunities with a strong return on investment. So I think one thing that we do see is a lot of companies overestimate how good they are. And they often refer to the best parts of their operation as an indicator of how well they're doing. But if we dig deeper, we'll find more savings. So, I would say very few companies, for example, are maxed out on investable energy saving measures. The really, really top guys, I mean, look at somebody like Swire Properties in this slide. They've done a lot, for many years, they still find more savings as they go deeper into their portfolio and become more sophisticated in the technologies and the data that they're gathering. So I'm always kind of pretty skeptical that there aren't any opportunities left. So I think the first thing to do is to check and have a really good look at it. And then I think the second thing is definitely when we come to the end of that efficiency curve, we're going to need to go and do the renewable switch. And that's where the renewable switch kicks in. None of our modeling is showing that companies can achieve these targets with energy savings alone. It all requires significant renewables component and significant renewables procurement to be successful. So if a company really has reached the end of the line, which I kind of doubt in most cases in Asia at least, we need to start talking renewables. So I had a couple of case studies, and really just to sort of illustrate what I'm talking about. Swire Props, a customer of ours, clearly using TCFD, doing the scenario planning, comprehensive portfolio approach, and now a new carbon target was released last year. More than 50% per square meter by 2030. And then recognizing that it's not just about owned and operated emissions, a target for tenants, the 28% target, and also a target for new build, understanding that the emissions associated with new build will become important as well, increasingly important over time. So even, again, their base year is 2018. Swire Props was working on energy saving a long time prior to 2018, but that's, you know, they still believe that even from that benchmark, they can drop 52% using energy saving and renewable energy procurement technologies. CDL, very similar. I dropped in an extract from their risk analysis. What T1 in this chart shows is this is the climate policy risk. So compared to other risks that they're looking at around water, insurance, waste, climate policy, and the ability of their infrastructure to be impacted by government regulation was highly certain and pretty severe. And so it's again, that kind of signals immediately existing building stock. Let's get those emissions down. And you can see their target, different baseline, similar order of magnitude to Swire Props, nearly 60%. And also an embodied carbon target as well to kind of go along with that. And you know, CDL also has a pretty strong green lease program to go for its tenants. So we can see that the leaders have reacted fairly recently to this. So a lot of these carbon targets, like 2019, I think, but they are very much aligning with this idea that we've got to get existing building emissions way down in order to manage risk. And then we can disclose that through TCFD and open up opportunities for ourselves as businesses. Last slide. And just a summary. As I said, I think it's moving from aspirational to risk management. Real estate vulnerable because it's significant and visible. We would expect this to mean a lot of new market entrants when it comes to thinking about carbon management and net zero, not just the sort of the top companies that we're used to seeing doing green building projects. Net zero is clearly a useful program because it kind of addresses these issues head on. We've got to start thinking portfolio wide rather than building by building. We can start looking for external financing if that's of value, and we believe strong ROI for all of this stuff in Asian markets is absolutely, you know, credible. And we can see from the leaders, they're already acting and providing really good examples that the rest of the market can learn from and follow. That's the end of my slides, Ding. Thank you.
Thank you, Liam. We do have a couple questions from the floor. Maybe a question from me first, because I'm the moderator, I have the advantage. So we see there's a trend for, you know, company a few years ago, they would say, this is how much I can reduce. So they would set a carbon reduction target, say, I'll reduce 10%, 20%. And then we see company then align their target with, for example, science-based target. instead of saying how much they can reduce, is how much they have to reduce. And then now
Yeah.
companies are even looking further, setting a net zero carbon target. And leaders, for example, like Microsoft, they are even becoming climate positive to offset all their
Yeah.
emissions from their operations since the very beginning when they opened their first office. So
Yeah.
what do you think about this transition? Why, like, where is like net zero carbon or climate positive come about? And do you think that would be the trend in the future?
Well, I mean, I think it has to be if we want to be successful at keeping temperature rise to manageable levels. I mean, I think actually what will happen is in a few years' time, the leaders will go further than they are doing at the moment, because we're not going to shift the whole portfolio in the same way, right? The leaders are going to overachieve, a bunch of the market will underachieve. Hopefully the middle of the market, we can pull it into a sort of a 1.5 degrees scenario. So I think the Microsoft example is interesting because they're starting to invest in offsets and sequestration. I do think we will see more of that in the future. We don't see very much of that at the moment.
Right.
The key for me is whether the mainstream is going to move to do something like net zero, right? If net zero by 2040, net zero by 2030 to 2040 for existing buildings, I think is consistent with, say, a 1.5 degrees outcome. If we can get the sort of the mid-market guys into that trajectory, then we've got a good chance, I think, of pulling emissions down fast enough to manage the climate challenge. And I think, in a way, part of that signal will come from governments. You know, if city governments are serious about their 80% targets, they've got to regulate on existing buildings. There's no question about it. And so we're at this stage, we're sort of saying, well, it's coming. Hopefully the regulator will move early enough for this risk to become even more visible to mid-market, so the mid-market will kind of jump. I think the risk is if we wait 10 years for, say, the Hong Kong government to regulate existing buildings, then that's too slow. So, you know, we can hope that governments will move quickly enough to make this risk visible. But right now, I think we're kind of showing to a lot of businesses, hey, this is coming anyway. TCFD is requiring you to analyze this. There's a cost saving. There's a reputational upside. We can get new finance. We should go ahead and move now. And that's a value proposition that I hope is going to be attractive, not just to the, you know, the top 10% that kind of gets this.
Right. I got a few more questions here, but I think I'll just take one because due to I'm conscious of time. So Liam, what would you say to a real estate company if they're planning to build a new building project? Like, because right now, how we in the real estate industry, usually it's the project management team that do the design of the building, while then once the building's been built, then facility management will take over, and then they will start thinking about any reduction initiative, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we, you know, integrate this idea of net zero carbon building or really energy efficiency building in terms of operational performance, like at the very beginning of the building design phase? Like, what would be your suggestion to real estate companies that are having new development right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two components to it. I think first of all, you should be designing to frankly, probably a carbon benchmark. At worst, maybe an energy efficiency benchmark. So perhaps per unit floor area that you think is resilient to where regulation is going to go. So I think, you know, you will have data on your existing buildings. We'll have data from GRESB on how other people's similar properties perform. Design ambitiously from an energy consumption perspective. Build in renewables if you can, and make sure that that number is low, because then you're going to be resilient to the next 30 years of regulation. Then with embodied carbon, it's a new area, I think, in terms of our ability to measure embodied carbon at scale. I think there are some good methodologies for estimating it. So I think it's worth, on the one hand, conducting an estimated embodied carbon calculation for your new building, and ideally looking for ways to future embodied carbon and disclosure of embodied carbon will also come. So it's still pretty early for embodied. The methodologies are still pretty new from a scalable commercial perspective, but I think calculating it is really important, and ideally trying to reduce it, perhaps compared to the last few properties that you developed, is a good way to move forwards. If you look at CDL and Swire properties, they both have embodied carbon reduction targets,
right,
for their new build, so to take that approach.
Agree. And I think like embodied carbon is one of the very important scope 3 emission that internationally real estate companies are setting targets on embodied carbon. I will take one last question. What is your opinion about cloud-based energy metering, and how important is real-time monitoring and total cost of ownership of such system compared to traditional BMS?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think what we have seen is that the software, the cloud-based energy management software got a lot better in the last few years, and it got a lot more affordable as well. So with the challenges that we've seen with BMS is essentially our ability to aggregate at the portfolio level. And so I think a lot of the cloud-based stuff can kind of pick it out of whatever you've got at the property level and push it all forwards to a sort of a, so that you can have a portfolio level perspective. I think that's really important. One thing that we see though is that building that kind of data strategy step by step is important. So some people will go in too fast, they'll spend too much money, they'll generate too much data, they won't be able to use that data, and then they'll say, well, that wasn't a very valuable investment, that software package, we're not getting value for money, and then they might stop. I think it's better to say, okay, what data do we need for which reasons when? Then you procure the software accordingly, you explain your data strategy to the software provider, and you make sure they kind of give you an offer that aligns with, your strategy. So strategy and data needs first, and then put that in your RFP, and the software provider should be able to respond to that. So, I think cloud-based is probably essential, but procure with care.
Right, thank you. That's a really great answer. So I'm conscious of time. So thank you, Liam. Thank you, everyone. Let me share my screen. So thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoy hearing from Liam about the Real Estate Carbon Zero program. And thanks, Liam, again for joining us today. Upcoming, we are hosting more webinar and symposium on innovation, building enhancement, as well as climate change. And the next one will be on hurdles in the innovation journey on 21st of July. We have Andrew Young from the Sino Group to cover how to transform businesses with innovation and how Sino Group have brought innovation into a living laboratory. You are most welcome to follow our LinkedIn page, Smart Energy Connect, visit our website at clpsec.com, and subscribe our newsletter so you can stay up to date on our latest events and news. Thank you, everyone, again for joining us with us today. We'll appreciate it if you could take a quick survey. You'll be receiving an email from us, and we hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.